The Wild West is not a place on the map, but a state of mind. There are no compromises here, and nature dictates its harsh rules. It is a place where nature does not forgive mistakes, and civilization is something distant and illusory. In the 19th century, thousands of people set out for these uninhabited lands to start a new life, where every day was a test of endurance. Their homes, log cabins, were their fortresses, their only protection from the cold, snow, and wind. Preparing for winter was not just a routine for them, but a vital ritual. Their lives depended on how well they sealed the cracks, gathered firewood, and stocked up on provisions. It was a time when man and nature were in constant dialogue, and only man made concessions. Today, we will immerse ourselves in the world of American settlers and learn how they prepared their huts for winter survival. Watch the video to the end to find out how they prepared their huts for winter using ancient techniques that seem impossible today. Preparations for winter began long before the first frosts, and the first step was always to gather firewood. This was not just a matter of collecting dry branches, but a whole ritual. Settlers chose trees with thick, straight trunks. They mainly used oak, ash, and maple, as these provided more heat and burned longer. The work went on all day, from dawn to dusk. The logs were chopped, split, and stacked in wood piles. It was important that the woodpile was located away from the house to avoid fire and protected from precipitation so that the wood would not get wet. A special method was used to stack the wood piles correctly. Each log was placed so that there was a small space between them for air to circulate. This allowed the wood to dry faster, which significantly increased its heat output. Some settlers stacked the woodpile in a circle, which gave it additional stability. This method required patience and precision, but it was very effective. Many settlers had their own unique methods, such as drying wood under a bark canopy, which protected the wood from rain but left it open to the air. Autumn days were filled with monotonous but important work, which began when the leaves started to turn yellow. Firewood harvesting was not just physical labor, but also a kind of meditation that allowed a person to merge with nature. The morning began with sharpening the axe and ended with the last blow as the sun set below the horizon. There were certain rules for gathering firewood among the settlers. Trees were only cut in certain places so as not to harm the forest, and part was always left for the following year. This was an unwritten rule that helped them survive in the wild. They understood that nature was their main ally and must be respected. This approach to nature was completely unique. Once the logs were harvested, they were transported to the house. Sleds were used for this, even if there was no snow yet. It was easier to transport heavy logs on sleds than to simply drag them along the ground. This method saved energy, which was very important, as there was still a lot of work ahead to insulate the hut. Many settlers had their own unique methods, such as drying wood under a bark canopy, which protected the wood from rain, but left it open to the air. Have you ever wondered what it would be like if we tried to survive in such conditions today? With all our modern tools, would we be able to cope? Leave your opinion in the comments. After the firewood was prepared, the second, equally important stage began: insulating the walls of the hut. The logs used to build the huts did not fit together perfectly. There were always small gaps between them through which cold air could penetrate. It was vital to close these gaps. To do this, the settlers used a technique called caulking. They took moss, grass, and clay, mixed them in certain proportions, and packed this mixture into the gaps between the logs. Moss collected in marshy areas was an ideal material because it did not rot and retained heat well. Clay, which they took from the banks of rivers, served as a binding agent. This mixture was packed into the gaps using wooden sticks and hammers. It was a very laborious and dirty process, but it was extremely important for survival. Walls insulated in this way could withstand the most severe frosts. Some settlers also used a mixture of crushed bark and water to fill larger gaps. This was another way of using natural materials to protect against the cold. The caulking process required not only physical strength, but also attention to detail. Every crack, even the smallest, had to be carefully filled. If even one was missed, it could lead to a draft, which could cause major problems during the harsh winter months. The settlers worked around the entire perimeter of the hut, paying special attention to the corners, where the logs did not always fit tightly together. In addition to caulking, they also insulated the walls from the inside. For this, they used clay plaster mixed with straw or grass. This mixture was applied to the interior walls, creating an additional layer of insulation. After drying, it became hard as stone and not only protected against the cold but also made the walls more durable. A distinctive feature was that the settlers often used not only clay but also charcoal, which was added to the mixture. The charcoal made the mixture darker, which helped it absorb more solar heat on rare sunny days. This simple but effective method was known to many. What was the most difficult part of building and strengthening such a hut on your own? We will answer this question very soon. The third stage of preparation for winter involves strengthening the roof and floor. The roof was the most vulnerable part of the hut. It had to withstand the weight of snow and not leak. The settlers covered the roofs with several layers. First, they laid a layer of thin boards, then a layer of bark and moss, and on top of that, another layer of boards. This created a reliable, multi-layered protection. In addition, they reinforced the floor. The floor in the huts was usually earthen. To protect themselves from the cold coming from the ground, the settlers covered the floor with a thick layer of straw or dry grass, and on top of that, animal skins. This was not only warmer, but also cleaner. For more reliable protection from the cold, they also made wooden flooring, which they raised a few centimeters off the ground. Straw was also laid underneath it. The uniqueness of this stage was that some settlers used stones they brought from streams to reinforce the roof. They laid them on the roof, which added extra weight and protected it from strong winds. This was a very ingenious solution. In addition to the multi-layered structure, the settlers paid special attention to the slope of the roof. They made it steep enough so that snow would not accumulate on it, but would slide off. This was critically important, as large accumulations of snow could collapse the roof. To make the snow slide off more easily, they also covered the top layer of boards with resin collected from pine trees. This created a smooth, waterproof surface. As for the floor, reinforcing it was not only a matter of warmth, but also of hygiene. The earthen floor was damp and cold, which made for uncomfortable living conditions. Therefore, the settlers prepared it carefully before laying it. They compacted the earth and then covered it with a thick layer of dry sand, which served as drainage. Only then were straw and wooden planks laid. Such a floor was not only warm, but also dry, which made life in the hut much more comfortable. Sometimes more permanent solutions were used for the floor. If there were suitable trees nearby, the settlers made a plank floor. But this was a very laborious process that required a lot of time and effort, as each board had to be cut by hand. Therefore, earthen floors with straw decking were more common. They were a practical and reliable solution in the wild. The hearth was the heart of every hut. Its condition determined how warm the house would be. Therefore, preparing it for winter was a very important task. The settlers carefully cleaned the hearth of soot and ash. They checked the chimney for cracks and gaps. If any were found, they were filled with clay. To ensure that the hearth burned evenly and gave off more heat, its inner walls were lined with stones, which accumulated heat well. This allowed the hearth to retain heat even after the fire had died down. Some settlers also made special niches in the walls of the hearth to heat food or water. This was very convenient. Once the hearth was ready, they gathered a supply of kindling, small dry branches, wood chips, and straw. All of this was stored next to the hearth so that it was always close at hand. The process of preparing the hearth was very important. In addition to cleaning it of soot, the settlers also made sure that the chimney was high enough so that the smoke would rise and not linger inside the hut. If the chimney was too low, smoke could fill the room, which would be dangerous. They also installed a protective cap on the chimney to prevent precipitation from getting inside. This cap, made of wood or metal, was another example of their ingenuity. The inner walls of the hearth were lined with stones that had been pre-fired in the fire. This made them stronger and able to withstand high temperatures. The stones were laid so that there were no gaps between them and then secured with clay. This created a strong, durable structure that could last for years. Once the hearth was completely ready, they conducted a test burn. This allowed them to make sure that everything was working properly and there were no problems. If the smoke went out without delay and the hearth gave off enough heat, it could be considered ready for winter. A supply of kindling was equally important. Small branches, wood chips, and straw were collected and dried in advance. This supply had to be sufficient to last the entire winter. If the supply ran out, it was necessary to go outside and search for kindling in the snow, which was very dangerous. What do you think was the biggest risk associated with the hearth for a lone person living in isolation? What would have happened if he had fallen asleep and the hearth had gone out and he had not had time to gather a supply of firewood? Of course, this is not as scary as losing all your food supplies. We will talk about this later. Keep watching. Food supplies were an equally important part of preparing for winter. In summer and autumn, the settlers gathered berries, mushrooms, and herbs. All of this was dried and stored in dry places. They also stocked up on salt, flour, and sugar, which they bought during rare trips to the city. To prevent food from spoiling, they used special storage methods. Meat was dried in the sun or smoked and then stored in dry, cool places. Grain and flour were kept in tightly sealed bags. Vegetables such as potatoes and carrots were stored in earthen cellars. The cellars were dug deep into the ground, reinforced with boards and covered with earth. This ensured a constant temperature and humidity. The method of drying meat was very effective. Meat was cut into thin strips and hung in the sun to dry completely. Sometimes, to give it a special flavor and preserve it better, the meat was smoked over smoldering coals. This process not only removed moisture, but also gave the product a special aroma that helped to brighten up the monotonous winter menu. Vegetables and grains also required special treatment. Potatoes and carrots grown in gardens were carefully selected and covered with straw before being placed in an earthen cellar. The straw prevented the vegetables from touching each other, preventing rot, and served as an additional insulator. In this way, supplies could be stored throughout the winter without losing their properties. To protect their supplies from rodents, they used unique tricks. Bags of flour and grain were hung from hooks on the ceiling or placed on high shelves where rodents could not reach them. The cellar itself was carefully camouflaged and protected from intrusion. Wood ash was often sprinkled on the cellar floor to serve as a natural barrier. These supplies were essential for survival. The loss of even a portion of the provisions could lead to starvation. Therefore, every bag, every jar, and every bundle of dried herbs was accounted for. Preparing provisions was the most important and responsible task because it determined whether they would be able to survive the harsh winter. Windows and doors were the biggest sources of heat loss. Therefore, insulating them was a very important task. The settlers made windows from thin wooden frames, into which they inserted pieces of leather or oiled paper. For the winter, they removed these panes and replaced them with thick wooden shutters. Doors were also insulated. The gaps between the door frame and the door were filled with moss, and the door itself was covered with skins. This created an additional barrier to cold air. To protect themselves from drafts, they also made special thresholds from thick logs, which were nailed to the floor at the door. Insulating the windows was a laborious but very important process. Pieces of leather soaked in fat let in a little light, but prevented the cold from entering. In winter, they were replaced with wooden shutters, which provided complete insulation, but deprived the hut of daylight. This was a compromise that had to be made. The shutters were made of thick planks and were so sturdy that they could withstand gusts of wind and the weight of snow. The doors were insulated with particular care. The gaps between the door frame and the door were plugged with moss, which did not rot and retained heat well. Then the door itself was covered with skins, which created an additional layer of insulation. The skins not only protected from the cold, but also helped to keep the heat inside. In addition, the settlers made special thresholds from thick logs, which they nailed to the floor at the door. This was not only to protect against drafts, but also to prevent street snow from getting inside. The threshold also served as a natural barrier that kept the heat inside and prevented it from escaping to the street. These measures to insulate windows and doors were vital. In harsh winters, when temperatures could drop very low, heat loss through cracks could lead to hypothermia. Therefore, every detail mattered. Every window and every door was carefully insulated to provide maximum protection. Which of these insulation measures do you think was the most effective? What would they have done if they had accidentally nailed the door shut so that they couldn't get out? Fortunately, they had thought of this in advance, which is why they paid so much attention to the tools we will discuss next. Preparing for winter also included preparing tools. Axes, knives, shovels, and other tools had to be in perfect condition. They cleaned them of rust, sharpened them, and lubricated them. To protect them from the cold, the settlers made special leather covers for the tools so that they would not freeze or deteriorate. They also made wooden boxes for storing tools, which they placed inside the hut so that they would not be exposed to moisture and cold. This stage was very important, as serviceable tools were essential for a successful winter. A blunt axe or a broken shovel could cause major problems. Therefore, each tool was carefully checked, cleaned of dirt and rust, and then sharpened. Sharpened tools worked faster and more efficiently, which saved energy. Lubricating the tools was an equally important part of the preparation. Animal fat or vegetable oil was used for this purpose. Lubrication protected the metal from rust and prevented snow and ice from sticking. Lubricated tools also worked more smoothly, which was especially important when working with frozen wood. Tool covers were made from leather obtained from hunting. Leather was the ideal material as it was durable, waterproof, and provided good protection from the cold. The covers were made to fit each tool so that they fit snugly and did not slip off. Tool storage boxes were made of wood. They were large enough to hold all the necessary tools but were still easy to carry. The boxes were kept inside the hut to protect them from moisture and cold. This was especially important for the metal parts of the tools, which could easily rust. This preparation process was very important, as it ensured readiness for any unexpected situations. In winter, when the weather was particularly harsh, reliable tools were the only thing we could count on. In the fall, they did a thorough cleaning of the hut. All unnecessary items were removed to free up space. There should be nothing extra on the floor or walls. Everything was put in its place. They also made special shelves and hooks for storing things to create more free space. Spring cleaning was not just a matter of tidying up, but a necessity of life. In the cramped conditions of the hut, everything had its place, and any disruption of order could lead to problems. Cleaning began with the floor. It was thoroughly swept and leveled, removing everything unnecessary. Then they moved on to the walls and ceiling, clearing them of cobwebs and dust. Organizing the space was a key part of preparing for winter. All furniture and belongings were arranged so as not to obstruct movement or create clutter. The bed was usually placed in a corner, and the table in the center so that it could be used for different purposes. All tools and provisions were laid out in their places so that they could be easily found in the dark or in confined spaces. Special shelves and hooks were made of wood. The shelves were cut from thick boards and nailed to the walls. Hooks were made from branches or nails if available. The shelves were used to store dishes, books, and other small items, while the hooks were used to hang clothes, bags, and tools. This freed up space on the floor and walls, which was very important. In addition, the settlers made special niches in the walls to store the most important things, such as salt, matches, and gunpowder. These niches were securely closed with wooden doors to protect the contents from moisture and dust. All this work was aimed at making the hut as comfortable and functional as possible. It was not just a dwelling, but a place where one could survive the harsh winter. Order and organization helped them keep their sanity and not give in to despair. The wind was one of their main enemies. To protect themselves from it, the settlers made special windbreaks. They installed them on the leeward side of the hut. These shields were made of large logs, which were placed at an angle so that the wind would slide over them and not hit the wall. Some also used large boulders, which they stacked in front of the walls of the hut. This not only protected against the wind, but also provided additional insulation. Preparing for the wind was just as important as insulating the walls. In the wild, the wind could be so strong that it could damage the roof or even move the hut. Therefore, the settlers paid special attention to this task. Windshields were made of thick, sturdy logs. They were placed a few feet away from the walls of the hut, creating an air cushion that served as an extra layer of insulation. These shields were not just walls, but a complex protection system. They were installed at an angle to deflect the wind and direct it away from the hut. The use of boulders was another ingenious solution. They collected large stones and placed them close to the walls of the hut. The stones, which accumulated heat well, helped to keep the hut warm even on the coldest days. This was especially important for the walls, which were most vulnerable to the cold. In addition, the settlers used natural barriers such as trees or rocks to protect their huts from the wind. They built their homes in places where nature itself provided protection. This was not only convenient, but also helped them save time and energy. This protection from the wind was vital. In conditions where there were no neighbors or help, every detail mattered. Protection from the wind not only allowed them to stay warm, but also made them feel more secure. And finally, the last but not least important stage, mental preparation. Life in isolation required a strong spirit. The settlers knew they would have to spend long months alone. They prepared for this by finding things to do. They carved wood, repaired tools, and wove baskets. This allowed them to stay sane and not give in to despair. Isolation was one of the greatest challenges for the settlers. Without neighbors, friends, or family, it is very easy to lose touch with reality. Therefore, they paid special attention to their psychological stability. They developed their own rituals and habits that helped them structure their day and not feel lost. The morning began with lighting a fire, then breakfast, and then work. Work was not just a necessity, but a salvation. It helped them take their minds off their loneliness. In addition to work, they came up with activities that helped them stay sane. They carved wood, creating small figures or decorations. It was not only a hobby, but also a way to express themselves. They also repaired tools, wove baskets, and sewed clothes. All these activities required concentration and helped them forget that they were alone. Many settlers also kept diaries or wrote letters that they hoped to send to the city when spring returned. It was a form of therapy that helped them express their thoughts and feelings. Their diaries were their only companions, and they helped them stay connected to the outside world. An important part of mental preparation was observing nature. They watched the changing seasons, the movement of the sun and stars, and the behavior of animals. This helped them feel like they were part of something bigger than just their cabin. Nature was their only companion, and they learned to understand its language. This allowed them not to feel alone, but instead to feel like they were part of a big and complex world. Preparing for winter on the frontier was not just work. It was a way of life where every detail mattered. From the first blow of the axe on the tree to the last handful of moss plugging a crack, it was all part of a single, complex ritual. Time when people relied only on their own strength and knowledge, their skills, ingenuity, and most importantly, their perseverance command deep respect. They didn't just survive, they built their lives in harmony with nature, using everything it had to offer. Which of these methods do you think was the most important for survival? What other topics related to settlers in the Wild West would you like to hear about? Write about it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos.